Hi folks, welcome to a thrilling new episode of the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast. Today I'm joined by Bohorquez and Mohamed Foustok, the founders of BoldType. We'll dive into the process for securing medical devices with tips from managers looking to improve their developments and engineers wanting to build more secure tech. Let's get started. Okay, could you please introduce yourselves and introduce what you guys do at the company?
Sure, yeah. So BoldType is a software development firm that specializes in medical device software, so provides cybersecurity consulting services. Most of the products that we develop for our clients are cloud connected, so there's usually an embedded component, and so we've got expertise along that entire software development chain. And then on the cybersecurity side, just got deep expertise there. You know, as I know you're very much aware, Matt, FDA on the US side has changed the rules in the last year and a half. We've got a lot of expertise there. So sometimes we'll help companies that are not our software clients to make sure that their systems are cyber secure.
Yeah, for sure. There's been a lot of it. I've seen the change. Jose, tell me a bit more about how medical device started for you. What was your journey through it?
Sure. My first experience with medical devices was back in 2002, I think it was. So about a little over 20 years ago. At GE Healthcare. And I did that right after my bachelor's. I went back to grad school, got a master's, then I got a PhD. And when I was starting my doctorate program, my advisors gave me a lot of freedom and leeway. And I asked them if I could do my doctorate on ultra low power circuits and systems for medical devices. And they agreed. So my work was in medical device development from that point. Launched a medical device company out of my doctorate program. I ran that for 7 years. And then started BoldType about 8 years ago now with Mohamed, and we have another partner, Andres. And so we've been doing that for about 8 years now.
Oh, wonderful. And you, Mohamed, how did the medical device come to you?
Yeah, so actually I wasn't in medical devices. I was in the communication side. I spent 15 years at Motorola working on two-way radio systems. So I was introduced more to the communication side and also the security side through with that Motorola experience. And then after I left Motorola, I started up doing my own consulting and met Jose, and we joined forces with BoldType. So my medical experience comes from the last 8 years at BoldType. And that was mostly just communications and security, but everything's tied together. So.
Yeah, we'll get to see this throughout this episode. So folks, what I'd like to do throughout this episode is to introduce our listeners to the principles of cybersecurity within the whole lifecycle of the device. So give an overview of what medical device manufacturers should expect from the FDA and other legislations in terms of cybersecurity. So could one of you walk us through, once we get the design inputs of deciding that we want a medical device, what are the things that we should start considering in order to build a secure medical device?
So when you start from the actual inputs itself, the first step is coming up with an architecture that can satisfy the needs that are defined. And normally we would do that anyway as part of medical device development. But now the difference is we layer in security right at that architecture phase. So we actually come up with what are the security aspects of the architecture that are of concern. Once we have the architecture defined, we then go and do a threat modeling analysis. And this is key. This is where you're looking at that architecture from a threat perspective and determining where are the weaknesses, what are the possible controls that you need, and classifying all the various threats. Typically, that's a loop. So you would come out of that threat modeling, and then if you define the controls, you come right back into architecture again to add those controls in, and then go through that loop. Eventually, you have an architecture and a threat model for that architecture with all of the threats identified and classified such that the risk level is acceptable for you to move forwards from there. So that's really that first phase. So it's important not to leave too early because you will have controls potentially missing, or you'll have threats that can't be mitigated with the controls that you have. So you do need to stay in that loop a little bit. Once you come through there, you're now into the more the development side. So now you're actually starting to build your system. And again, normally you would follow a formalized flow of building your medical device system. The difference here with security is, again, security is running by the side. So as an example, you're building your system, you're going to need to add tests around security. That's the first thing you think. You're building normal functional tests, but now you're building security tests as well. You are using third-party building blocks, which is very typical in any software development. Well, you have to consider the security now, not just the functional aspect, but the security of those building blocks. Those building blocks may have already known issues that you have to then mitigate yourself, or they may be unacceptable and you have to select alternatives. So there's a whole process you have to go through as you're building your system to keep security in mind. Once you've built it, finished the building of it, and you're going to perform any formalized verification and validation, you do your cybersecurity testing alongside. So you're doing functional verification and validation and security, essentially validation at the same time. All of that output then at the end is essentially your completed project. So now you have a project that has all of the functional aspects completed, all of the security aspects documented and completed. You output something like an SBOM, which is a manifest of all of the third-party pieces.
Wow.
And then you have analysis accompanying that of any of the known vulnerabilities of those third-party pieces particularly. You have to qualify that none of those vulnerabilities affect you, or if there is an effect, its risk level is low enough that you're not concerned by it. And along with all of that is your management plan, because this is a little bit of a difference, is that unlike a functional project where you say, I've completed, I'm satisfied, and I can launch it, with cybersecurity, it's living, because threats will change after you deploy. New threats will occur. New attackers come up with new techniques. So you can't just stop there. Your plan will include periodic reviews, periodic checks on what vulnerabilities are now, what new ones exist. That may drive you to do an update cycle where you're going to mitigate some of those new threats, and you keep going. So it's now a living project. And FDA will actually require you to commit to a plan, to commit to how often you're going to be checking, how you're going to be notifying your clients if there is an issue, how fast you're going to react to such issues. And of course, this will depend a lot on the device itself, on whatever is your medical device project, and what risk it poses to the human being as well that's using it. Because if it's something that's very minimal, you have a little bit more leeway in terms of how rapidly you can respond. Whereas if it's a device that, for instance, could cause serious injury or potentially death to a patient, you have to be able to respond very quickly if an attacker is able to penetrate your system. That's a very quick overview of the entire process. The important thing is that security goes right along the rest of your development. It's not something you think about afterwards. It's not something that you just do once and forget about. It's a continuous activity that is integrated within your entire development and goes on beyond the launch of your product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too often we're thinking about security at the end of a process. So I'd like to focus a bit more on the first part, let's say the security architecture piece. Where you talked about threat modeling, you talk about focusing on a system. But the thing is, a lot of times we're seeing more and more medical devices working within a system of systems. So we talk about cloud, different connected devices. So where do you start? If you have a series of medical devices, should you look at them as a whole? Should you look at them as individual components? How would you start the security architecture piece?
Right, very good question and very good point. Jose, if you want to jump in, feel free. But okay. So the simple answer is you must consider the entirety of your system. You can't just ignore your system and think about individual pieces, although it is important to focus on the pieces as well at the right time. But I think that, so to begin with, you look at your overall system and all of the interconnects between them, because, and this can include non-medical devices also. As an example, maybe you have a medical device that has a cloud, that's fine, and it's going through what would be considered, the medical device data system in the middle. So it's not really part of the medical device. It's outside of what would classically be a submission, a 510K in the US. So you're effectively bridging over things that you don't control, but that does not change the fact that your information has to flow through there. Your control paths flow through there. So it is part of your security analysis to see what impact those things that are out of your control will have on your secure parts of your system. You can't ignore those, and FDA won't let you. So if you're not looking at the holistic view of your system, they will point that out to you. So you begin by looking at your entirety of your system, anything that touches your devices, effectively, whatever is your medical devices. And you have to also be careful that not to just consider the interconnects that you have designed to use for a medical purpose. As an example, you may have an interface on your device that you think this is just for manufacturing. It's not something that's going to be used in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that may be true from your perspective, but from an attacker perspective, that's an interface they can get into your device through. So you can't ignore those. You can't just look at the things that you expect to be used. You have to look at everything that could be used. So if whatever interfaces you have to your device are fair game for an attacker to attack you through. The attackers won't just go through the paths that you think are the ones they should use. They'll use anything they can. So basically, that's something also to consider. You have to look at all your points of penetration, and you have to look at how your devices live in the ecosystem of the entirety of the system they're in. And those are the views you create out of your architecture, is those broader views of how it fits in. And then when you start your threat modeling, because you brought that up, now you focus in threat modeling. If you think about this as a threat model, a model isn't just one thing. It's not one view. It's a collection of things. So in your threat modeling, you're actually looking at different aspects of your system. You simplify it down for the purpose of analysis. So you'll look at this part of your system. Let's say you're looking at general data flow. You're uploading data from your medical device to your cloud. Well, you can create a model of that flow, and you can analyze that flow. How does that pass through various entities? Where are the threats, et cetera? Well, that's just one data flow. You may then look at and say, well, I want to be able to update my device. Well, that's a different data flow. Data's going to come from a different source and ending up at your device. So you can model that flow and then analyze that flow. And similarly with other aspects of your system. So your model needs to basically look at the different aspects of your system. How is information transitioning through your system? How is it protected? Where are the vulnerabilities? What controls can you put in, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. So perhaps, Jose, I'd like to call upon your experience being having been a medical device manufacturer. How do you integrate security into a team where there's very different talents and not all of them are knowledgeable or experts even in cybersecurity? How do you make them think about cybersecurity from the start?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, I would say not everybody in the development team has to be a cybersecurity expert. You don't want to create a burden for your team that goes, beyond what's really necessary. You definitely want to make sure that you have a software architect on the team that understands security. And if that's not part of your team, then you want to bring somebody on, as a consultant perhaps, who understands that. As Mohamed was saying earlier, really at the heart of cybersecurity is what's your architecture. Because if you have vulnerabilities that are inherent to the architecture and you don't resolve them early in the process, then down the line, you're going to start writing code, you're going to start designing the product, and you're going to find vulnerabilities that actually force you to re-architect your system, take 2 steps back instead of potentially 1. So having somebody in that position who understands how to properly architect the overall system is really critical. Now, if you've got somebody maybe down, it's a system that maybe includes embedded software and mobile application and cloud. It may be that, if you've got a more junior embedded software person, they don't need to have all the intricate knowledge of cybersecurity, so long as they've got that, expert in cybersecurity who can review the code with them, review the architecture with them, and ensure that proper controls are put in place. So there's a balancing act there. I don't think it's necessary for an entire team to be experts in cybersecurity. You want to make sure that they understand the basics of it, that they understand, what the various threats are for their part of the system, for example. But you do need at least one person on the team who can evaluate the full system and understand where those vulnerabilities might be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Having one person who can answer, give direction as well. But then when we move to the design and development piece of the puzzle, engineers and the different people building code and the application, the architecture, might be working not as much as a team as when they were working on the architecture, right? They'll be coding on their own. Are there mechanisms out there to keep in mind that secure coding practices code are being followed? How do you manage all of this?
So now, once you descend into the development area, I mean, first off, it's not a bad idea for engineers, software developers in general, to understand the principles of secure software development. I mean, defensive or secure programming has been around for a long time. And it's generally speaking, not just for cybersecurity. It's good. There are lots of good techniques that folks should be aware of for making even functional development more robust. And security and robustness do come tied closely to each other. Systems that are robust are oftentimes quite secure. And the corollary is also true. Systems that are not robust are generally insecure. So
by robust, we mean available. We mean
more around like, robustness, meaning that they won't break down with, for instance, at the slightest inputs that are not expected, basically. So that would be a robustness. Availability is a secondary factor, which is if they do fail, they're able to come back up, they're able to recover, which is also good. It's not a bad thing. But primarily from a pure security perspective, it's more important to be robust. Because oftentimes the way security attacks happen is effectively to break into the areas where you're not robust. They take advantage of your non-robustness effectively. Like for instance, simple things like if you've got the protocol and you're sending data on that protocol, are you robust enough to handle errors in the protocol where elements don't have the right sizes or data isn't of the right type and things like that? That's general robustness, but it's exactly where an attacker would attack you from. They would intentionally break your protocol by giving it data that it's not expecting. So those techniques are relatively straightforward to learn. Now that's just one part. Now after that, there are tools. There are tools that can be used to audit. There are automated tools. There's manual tools, and then there's things like reviews, as Jose mentioned. There's expert reviews that can be used. So there are lots of ways where you can make your system more secure as you're developing it. And it will depend a little bit on the skill set and the experience of whoever's developing it. So some developers will have gone through it and understand it more. Others may make mistakes, and then you have to catch it through other means, through like reviews or test protocols and things like that. So
application.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about some of those tools that so we're talking about tools that will detect vulnerabilities, that will verify codes. What kind of tools are we working here with?
Yeah, there are, I mean, it depends a lot on the type of language you're using. So that is an important part. First off, when I say tools, it's actually more a generalized term. There are, more robust languages, for instance, have better protection than others. So a language such as TypeScript, as an example, is going to be generally more secure than a language like JavaScript. They're very closely related, and I'm just giving this an example because oftentimes the same developers could be using one or the other. The additional type checking that's being done by your compilers, and the tool chain in general will enforce certain constraints on you that in principle will force you to do things that will become eventually more secure. So things like just as simple as that, the choice of language. And I would highly recommend that people don't choose a language and then disable all the checks it has, because that's unfortunately a bad practice that people do, especially when they're not sure what to do. So, the tools will be warning them and saying, there's a problem here. You haven't initialized something, or you're not checking for the range, or you're doing something doesn't look right. And the instinct is, no, I know better. I'm just going to tell it to turn off. And that's a bad practice. You actually should always understand what it is telling you and go and figure out what's the right way of doing that, not figuring out that it's wrong and I'm right, technically.
And so will these tools that you're talking about, will they be able to detect such errors in the code, such lack of protection from the developer?
They can. I mean, so there's static analysis. A lot of these are based on static analysis. So there's static analysis tools. Oftentimes you don't even notice them. They're built into your IDEs. They're automatically checking. These days with a lot of modern IDEs, a lot of this is done for you. There's not a lot that you have to do other than pay attention to what it's telling you. So static analysis is very common. There is dynamic analysis. There are dynamic analysis tools. They're more involved. They're more like developing essentially unit tests that are executed dynamically on your system, and they will reveal flaws in your system. But that requires you to invest in defining the tests that are for them. We're talking about programming tools here. So during your development, you're really relying a lot on the static analysis, dynamic analysis of your system as it's being built. It's very typical, especially with anything that's more cloud-based or web-based, an app, for instance, it's highly likely that you're pulling in libraries from third parties. And what you don't realize sometimes is you might pull in one library and you may think, oh, well, this is a library I'm using. I'm just going to use part of this library. But you may not realize that that library is pulling in 10 or 12 other libraries. And issues can occur not in your immediate dependency, but downstream. So there could be a vulnerability in some downstream component that you're not even aware of. And that vulnerability causes whatever it is that you're pulling in to be vulnerable, which by definition then makes your product vulnerable. And understanding those things is a bit trickier. And there are tools for that as well. There are various auditing tools that can be used to discover vulnerabilities in downstream components. There are databases, CVE databases, for instance, that can be used to look up known issues within components. So those are oftentimes things that are missed. People don't realize how much baggage they may be carrying in their system from all of the third party. One of the things I think that is also good practice is to be careful of your dependencies. Don't pull in things you don't really need. Find subsystems with the least number of dependencies. In other words, generally use things that are tighter to what you need, as opposed to trying to use things that are trying to be like the Swiss Army knife and give you all kinds of things that you don't really need, because they're probably pulling in 100,000 things that you, beyond that you probably don't want to have. And I think that's the scary part. When you look at some of the SBOMs and you suddenly think, I'm pulling in 3 dependencies and my SBOM has, 950 libraries inside it. Where did they all come from? And the bigger it is, the more you work you're going to have to figure all this stuff out, right? So,
sure. That goes. Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
Well, yeah, no, just that, to just kind of speak more to what Mohamed's saying is that then that effort then carries on to, post-market, because if you've got a software bill of materials that SBOM Mohamed's talking about, and it's got 900 line items, then you're going to have to monitor all of those for vulnerabilities. And, the possibility that one of those pops up with a new vulnerability and you have to evaluate the impact on your device, and you may have to do a patch or software update on your system, that exponentially grows the more dependencies that you have in your software bill of materials. So there's a high value to having elegant design. So this part of this goes back to architecture, and part of it goes through the design phase of having elegance in your design, meaning what's the simplest solution that can be implemented that pulls as little as possible from other sources that you have less control of. Because the other piece of it, as Mohamed's talking, the piece that you develop is less available to the outside world and, to threat actors to evaluate and try to get into. Whereas if you're pulling a library that's being used by thousands of products out there, there's a larger threat surface that's more appealing to threat actors to go and try to find vulnerabilities and attacks, right? So there's just a higher likelihood that they're going to be able to find vulnerabilities in those. Which is not to say you should never use open source software or other types of libraries that are out there, but just be smart about it and do try to be elegant in the way that you're designing your systems.
Yeah, be responsible, because there has to be a right trade-off, right, between what are the additional benefits my product gets for adding each additional library versus what are the costs in terms of additional risk.
And it's an awareness. And one of the things that, I know this is very specific to FDA, but it's actually a really good practice, something to think about is also, for instance, be aware of, okay, I'm pulling in this third-party piece. Great. On the surface, it looks like it gives me exactly what I want. Okay, who's maintaining that? How long is it being maintained for? Am I sure that whoever it is that's maintaining it is going to pay attention when there's a vulnerability and is going to patch it quickly and is going to let us know that it is available and it'll update, et cetera. So understanding and being aware of where you're getting pieces from becomes far more important from a security standpoint. And again, I know we're talking from the perspective of security, and security is a forcing function that's making us do these things. But in general, these are actually good practices, even if you were not thinking about security. The same rules really apply. A good, robust design that works well and meets its needs should be built on pieces themselves that are robust and meet the need, that are well maintained. There's nothing completely novel from a security standpoint. It's just that security is becoming a forcing function. It's making you do things that are good practices anyway, and probably good for your product in general anyway. And that's how I like to think about it, is you shouldn't really view security as this extra thing that you're having to do that you really don't want to do, and it's painful, and it's causing you all this extra time. On the contrary, actually, you should actually almost embrace it. It's actually a good thing that's going to make you create a product that's actually better, that's going to be more appealing to your customers, that's going to work better in general.
Beyond medical devices, just in general, security helps to make things better in general. Jose, we talked about risk, and I want to understand a bit from the FDA point of view. If there's a risk out there, how do you decide whether a risk is acceptable, unacceptable? When do you know when you should set controls? How does this all determined?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's one of the things that really distinguishes cybersecurity from normal kind of harm risk analysis. I almost think of risk in 3 different categories. So there's the normal risk that we're used to in medical devices around what harm's going to happen to the patient, and you're looking at, probabilities and severity. There's the usability types of risks, which are a little bit different, right? So that's why you have standards like 62366, where it speaks to, okay, now it's not just does something fail in the device, but does a human being mess something up, right? Do they use things in a way that you're not expecting them to? Mm-hmm. And then cybersecurity is a little bit different too, because you're not having things just spontaneously fail. You're having a risk that's created because there's a threat actor. There's an actual person who's trying to do harm. And so from a risk analysis standpoint, that changes things. You're no longer thinking about things as much from a probability standpoint. You're really thinking about things more from a vulnerability standpoint. Like, how experienced does a threat actor need to be in order to do harm here? How much work are they going to have to go through, right? Is this the kind of vulnerability, that a kid in his basement is going to be able to, search on the internet and now interfere with the functionality of this device? Or is it the kind of threat where you're going to need a nation state type of, support to be able to break into something? That's going to impact, like, what's the level of risk associated with a particular vulnerability and a threat. Similarly, what is the overall impact going to be? So Mohamed mentioned earlier, people sometimes think, well, my device isn't designed to connect to the cloud, so I don't even have to worry about cybersecurity. But as Mohamed said earlier, if your device has a physical interface that's used just to program it during manufacturing, that's actually a path through which harm could be done. So for example, the device can be reprogrammed without somebody knowing to do something that it's not supposed to do. Now, which of these is a greater threat from an overall impact? Well, if somebody can hack into your cloud system and send an over-the-air software update to thousands of devices, clearly that's going to have a larger footprint in terms of impact than if somebody has to physically get a hold of your device to reprogram it, right? So you're still thinking about it from an impact standpoint of harm, yes, but not just physical harm. Like one of the common types of attacks that happen are denial of service types of attacks, for example, where a hacker may break into a system and just shut down functionality across a fleet of products. And the primary reason they do that is to then be able to come to the manufacturer of the device and ask for ransom, right? Because now you've shut down their business. You're causing tremendous reputational harm to the manufacturer by the path of causing potential harm to a lot of patients. So you have to be thinking about it from a risk standpoint of not just what's the harm that could happen to a patient, but how many patients could be impacted at the same time. What's the level of experience and expertise that's needed? So it's a little bit of a different mentality that you have to have as you're looking at risk analysis for cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting how you bring up the personas that will end up manipulating the device, whether it's the manufacturer, the clinicians, the users. Perhaps last question from cybersecurity and from the medical device. How do you compare all of these risks when you put it together? What should be some criteria that you should look for in order to put out the final justification as to whether the device is secure enough, safe enough to justify the benefits?
So then, unwind it a little bit. First of all, you really do want to be using a standardized framework for assessing all your risks, cybersecurity risks. So you got to start there, because otherwise you're not really comparing apples to apples here. So you begin by deciding on what is your risk estimation framework. So you use those to evaluate your risks and come up with a standardized assessment of the scoring of that risk. So that'd be your first pass. And you can, from there, group your risks into what is considered low and acceptable and what are the high risks. Then the next phase of the evaluation is to bring in the patient harm, the breadth of the failure. There's other aspects too. Can it be used, for instance, to attack downstream systems? If you're building a system that goes into a hospital, I mean, we didn't really talk much about that, but sometimes the risk isn't even to your device. You're building a device, and maybe it is a relatively simple diagnostic device, but that diagnostic device is connected into a larger hospital system. An attacker could use your device and then piggyback through your device into the hospital system, for instance. Is that a risk to be concerned with? And there are lots of variables here, but fundamentally, once you have everything standardized in terms of scoring, your next level down is to distill it down, focus on the higher level risks, essentially, and evaluate them for the harm and ultimately the cost of the damage that such a thing could cause. I don't think you can ever come up with a system that's so cyber, the cost to do that would be too much. Have I raised the bar far high enough that the cost for an attacker to come in and attack my system is so high that the reward they're going to get from that system is not worth it? And if you do that, you've got an adequate defense. Now, the bigger the gap is, the more defended you are. Because again, attackers are opportunistic. For the most part, attackers are not going to go and spend millions of dollars to attack a system where the reward for them is going to be $10,000. That's a losing business for them. They're not going to do that. But certainly they'll spend $1 million to attack a system if they can reap $10 million of reward out of it. So sometimes it just comes down to that, understanding the risk reward of what's the cost reward. How high is my barrier now to an attacker? And what, if they were to get through, what would I lose essentially out of it? And, so sometimes it's those types of decisions.
And it's a conclusion to the episode. Huh? Jose?
It's a little frustrating just because it is subjective, but I mean, it's like FDA, even what they tell you is you should have reasonable assurance.
Yeah.
You're going, okay, what's reasonable, right? It is a bit subjective there. So you try to some objective criteria and then judge against that, but the establishment of the criteria is somewhat subjective. So you just have to use good judgment.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's a beautiful conclusion to the episode, saying that hackers are a business, ultimately attackers are a business, and they have to justify. So yeah, thinking about it is a beautiful way to finish it. Folks, if people want to find out more about BoldType or about what you do, where can they go?
We've got our website, BoldType.com. You can look me up on LinkedIn, Jose Bohorquez. And yeah, you can also just email us at info@BoldType.com.
Wonderful. Jose, Mohamed, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, folks, here's what we've learned throughout this episode. Number one, include cybersecurity from the start, especially when it comes to architecture. You should have at least one security-savvy architect on the team in order to avoid major reworks later on. Number two, you should minimize third-party dependencies. Each additional library increases the security risk and creates more components to monitor for vulnerabilities later on when it's on the market. And number three, security controls should match attacker incentives. Attackers operate like businesses and won't spend more on attacks than they can gain from it. So keep that in mind when it comes to securing your devices against cyber attacks. Do you want to level up your knowledge? Then you should visit cyberdoctornotes.com for weekly tips on securing your medical devices delivered straight into your inbox. I'm Mathieu Peteau, Cyber Doctor, and I'll see you on the next one.